The river did not flow. It crawled, swollen and sluggish, as though it carried 1,000 corpses beneath its skin. The Mississippi at dawn was no gentle sight. It rolled dark and swollen, a vast body heavy with secrets too long kept. Mists clung, low to its surface, curling and recoiling as if afraid of what lingered beneath. The waters seemed blacker than night itself, though the sun had already risen, its pale light failing to pierce the current's depths. Travelers along its banks often claimed they heard voices in the early hours, faint and frayed, murmuring, in tongues both English and older still. But on this morning in 1861, the whispers were not distant. They pressed close, crowding the ear like the breath of the drowned. The fishermen who dared cast their nets here spoke of pulling up not only catfish, but fragments of bone, lengths of rope stiff with rot, iron shackles locked and rusted shut. They would throw them back quickly, murmuring prayers that seemed only half remembered, lest their own nets begin to drag something heavier, something that still struggled. Obadiah stood on the riverbank that morning, his silhouette long and rigid against the fog. His eyes did not follow the current, but seemed to sink through it, past the reeds and shifting driftwood into the belly of the river itself. He whispered his own name into the mist, as though testing if the river would echo it back. It did not. Instead, another name, broken and half-gasped, rose in his ears. Isaac! Isaac! The reeds bent as though a breath had passed through them. Obadiah did not turn away. He knew the river was a ledger, its pages written not in ink, but in bone. Every lash, every hunger, every body chained to stone and tossed like carrion, here. The river remembered all. It never forgot. It never forgave. The air grew heavier, weighted with dampness and something acrid, like old iron left too long in rain. He closed his eyes and listened. They thought us swallowed. The voice was faint, slipping just below the lap of the current. But the river kept us. The waters swelled, a ripple shivering outward though no boat passed. Obadiah's boots sank deeper in the mud, yet he did not move. Who speaks? He asked, though his voice was little more than a thread. The reeds hissed. The water answered. Those bound. Those unnamed. Those who drag chains in the silt where no light walks. A silence pressed after, so vast and suffocating it seemed. The world itself held its breath. Then came the gurgle, the unmistakable human gurgle of someone choking, drowning, lungs bursting as they fought for air. It rose from the center of the river and then cut off sharp, leaving only the black water heaving in its wake. Obadiah's hands clenched at his sides, fingernails digging until they split skin. He let the blood fall freely to the mud. The river seemed to drink it hungrily, a brief hiss as droplets struck the water's edge. The mist swirled tighter, curling around him, and Obadiah thought he saw them forming shapes. Not whole bodies, no, half-formed faces, open mouths straining with eternal screams. Fingers without hands reaching toward him before dissolving back into vapor. The air stank of brine and rot, though the river had not yet claimed him. They will not be forgotten, he whispered as though bargaining. The Mississippi roared suddenly, not with waves but with voices. 100 at once, all layered, all crying, weeping, wailing. Some shouted prayers, others curses. Some screamed until their throats tore open in ragged agony. The water foamed and pitched, though the sky above was calm and clear. Obadiah staggered, back, but the mud clung to his boots, holding him firm as if the earth itself had chosen sides. He bent low, pressing his palm to the soil, feeling the vibration of voices not just in the air, but beneath his skin. The river was not just a body of water. It was a wound infected and festering, its fever rising, ready to break. From across the water, faint and spectral, came the rattle of iron, shackles striking shackles, dragging, scraping. Something, no, many things, were moving in the depths. Do you hear us? The river moaned. I do, Obadiah whispered, breath ragged. The voices converged, threading into one sound, neither fully human nor wholly beyond. Then you will carry us. You will chain them as they chained us. You will bury them as we were buried. You will not forget as the river has not forgotten. The surface of the Mississippi rippled, and for one unbearable instant, the fog thinned. Beneath, not fish, but Faces turned upward, pale and swollen, mouths yawning open to drink the dawn. Their eyes, clouded, waterlogged, white as river pearls, fixed upon him, and then the water closed smooth as glass, leaving only a ripple where they had been. The river stilled. The mist folded in. Obadiah stood alone again on the bank, but his name felt heavier in his mouth. It no longer belonged to him alone. It had been spoken into the current, and now the current kept it. Behind him the crows began to circle, black wings blotting the thin sun. Their cries like warnings dragged through rust. He turned toward the fields where the house of shuttered windows waited, and the overseers still dreamed their last unbroken sleep. But the river hummed after him, a low growl, promising it would follow, promising it would not forget. And as he stepped away from its bank, something unseen reached up through the mud, wrapping cold fingers around his ankle, just tight enough to remind him he was already marked. The river had chosen him, and it would call him back. Do you want me to continue into Chapter 2, Overseers in Chains of Silence, in the same style, so it reads as a seamless, cursed manuscript? The silence came first, sudden as a blade, stripping even the birds of their dawn song. The overseers stirred in their narrow beds, their breath shallow, their lips parched, tongues heavy as if caked with earth. One by one, they reached for water. Jugs at their sides, yet the vessels were dry, bone-dry, as though someone had poured them out in the night and left only dust behind. Their throats rasped, opening and closing like fish on a riverbank, but no sound came forth. The great house loomed still around them, shuttered and suffocating, its timbers creaking as though each beam bore witness to their unease. It was not only thirst that gnawed at them. Something else pressed harder, unseen, a weight upon the chest, upon the throat, forcing their sins upward but denying them the breath to speak them. They rose clumsily, boots scraping wood, gestures frantic and broken. One man pounded his fist against the doorframe as if to jar loose the voice that had abandoned him. Another clawed at his throat until red tracks bloomed upon the skin. Their faces mottled, veins swelling at the temples, yet still their cries did not form. The air itself had thickened. It was as if the house had drawn a long, deep breath and refused to let it out. Dust floated slow and deliberate, motes drifting, like ashes suspended in a breathless room. Every step they took seemed muffled, swallowed before it reached the ear. From the far corner, Overseer Brandt tried to force a sound. His lips stretched wide, jaw trembling, but all that spilled was a gasp, no word, no curse, not even a plea. His eyes darted to the others, and in their faces he saw his own terror mirrored. Men accustomed to command, now reduced to silence, their power rotting in their mouths. A whisper stirred, not from them, but through them. Do you remember their voices? The question hung in the air, soft as smoke. The overseers froze, the cries in the fields, the hymns in the dark, the wailing carried to the river's edge. Do you remember them? The men looked to each other, wide-eyed, though none dared nod. Their silence was no longer choice, but sentence. Then came the rattle. At first faint, then rising, chains, heavy iron chains dragging across unseen floors, winding through unseen corridors. The sound wormed its way into their bones, each link echoing against their teeth. They spun about, searching for the source, but the house was empty save for them. Still, the clinking persisted, circling, tightening, until it seemed the chains were coiling around their very throats. Overseer Hale fell to his knees, fingers clawing at the air, struggling to wrench something unseen away from his neck. His mouth opened wide, wider, his jaw straining, but only dust slipped past his lips, spilling in grey streams down his chin. He convulsed, eyes rolling, before slumping to the floor. The others backed away, their boots dragging slow and unwilling, as if the boards themselves had grown sticky with unseen blood. The silence deepened, now absolute. Even the sound of breath seemed stolen. The overseers staggered, lips cracked, eyes watering, trapped in a world without voice. And then, from the rafters above, came the whisper of hymns. Faint, trembling, yet unmistakable, the sound of enslaved. Voices raised in midnight prayer. It slipped through the silence like a knife, each note sharper than steel, each word a nail. O Lord, let the mighty fall silent. Let their tongues cleave to the roof of their mouth. The overseers trembled, sweat slick upon their brows. They shook their heads as if to banish the sound, but the hymn swelled, voices layering, multiplying, filling every crack in the walls. The very house seemed to thrum with it, windows rattling, shutters bowing. The men clutched their ears, but still the hymn seeped through bone and marrow. Tears carved pale lines through the grime of their faces. For the first time, their silence was not simply absence, it was condemnation. Obadiah's shadow crossed the threshold then, tall and deliberate. He did not speak, for he had no need. The house spoke for him, the air suffocated for him, the chains rattled on his behalf. He merely raised one hand, and the hymn quieted to a low, throbbing hum, as though the voices below had bent their heads in unison. The overseers fell against, the walls their eyes wide with terror, their chests heaving, yet still no sound passed their lips. They were fish in a net now, caught, thrashing in silence, their fate already sealed. Obadiah's gaze swept across them, slow and unblinking. "Your tongues," he whispered, though the words seemed to come not from his mouth, but from the house itself, are buried where theirs were buried. "You will not command again, you will not curse again, you will not pray again." His hand fell to his side, and with it the silence deepened into something absolute, smothering, eternal. The overseers clawed at their throats once more, desperate, frantic. Yet in their terror, they did not notice the dust shifting at their feet, gathering, thickening, curling into shapes, fingers, hands, arms clawing upward from beneath the boards, from beneath the soil, from beneath the house itself. The hymn began anew, louder, more dreadful, swelling like a tide, and as the first grey hand seized Brant's ankle and dragged him screaming but soundless into the floorboards, the others saw what silence had been preparing all along. The earth was opening, and it was hungry. The house did not breathe. It brooded, its frame sagging like a body that had forgotten how to die. No glass caught the light, for every window had been smothered, nailed from the inside with boards warped and splintered. Yet the house was not dark. Something moved within. Shadows pacing against curtains yellowed with age, shadows cast by no fire, no lamp, no sun. They drifted like restless animals circling a cage, never pausing, never free. The overseers had once claimed dominion here. Its timbers were raised by enslaved hands, its walls fattened by their sweat, its ceilings echoing with their wails, muffled into silence. Yet now the house turned against its keepers. The nails groaned, bending in their sockets, as if eager to release what they imprisoned. The walls pulsed faintly, boards straining like ribs around a lung that had inhaled centuries of grief and refused to exhale. Obadiah stood before it, boots sunk deep in the churned mud. Behind him, the river whispered, urging him forward. Before him, the shutters quivered with the movement of unseen things. The air pressed colder here, heavy with mildew, iron, and something sour, something like milk long curdled, hidden in a dark corner until it learned to breathe. He laid his hand upon the wood. It was damp, slick, as though the house itself sweated with fever. Beneath his palm he felt not timber, but a slow, deliberate thud-thud as though a heartbeat inside. The wind shifted. The curtains within stirred, though no draught entered. From the eaves, a voice slithered low, female, trembling yet sharp. "They never left us. They never let us go." Obadiah's hand stilled. Another voice rose deeper, ragged as if from a torn throat. "Their boots on our backs, their laughter in our hunger. We pace until the windows break." The shutters rattled hard then, nails screeching like iron dragged against stone. Dust cascaded from the roof beams. The crows that circled above took wing at once, black bodies scattering into the pale sky. Obadiah did not flinch. He pressed harder against the wood, listening. Inside, the pacing quickened. Shadows flickered, violently against the curtains, darting, colliding, staggering, in a dance that was neither living nor dead. The boards creaked as if under many feet, heavy, stomping, frantic. The noise swelled, pressing outward, until it seemed the house would burst its own frame. Then, silence. Every shadow froze. The curtains hung still. The house shuddered once, and then went utterly quiet. Obadiah stepped back. The silence did not ease. It was taut, stretched thin as wire, ready to snap. Then came the knock. It was not one knock, but many, dozens, from every wall, every shutter, every door. Fists beating from the inside, palms slamming, knuckles splitting against the wood. The overseers, trapped within, were awake now. Awake and desperate. Obadiah closed his eyes. He heard their bodies hurling against the nailed frames, their muffled bellows strangled before they could form sound. Their breath came hot against the shutters, staining the wood with moisture. He smelled them. Sweat, fear, decay, seeping through the cracks. And then he heard something else. A prayer, faint, childlike, sung in a whisper beneath the chaos. Steal away home. I ain't got long to stay here. The hymn threaded through the pounding fists, weaving around the muffled screams. It was not a voice from the overseers. It was older, buried deeper, a voice that remembered, a voice that had never stopped singing. The shutters shook violently, as though the house itself were choking on memory. The hymn grew louder, more insistent, until the pounding ceased. The overseers fell still, their shadows pressed against the curtains like drowned faces against glass. Obadiah opened his eyes, the shutters split, not outward, but inward, as if sucked toward a darkness that yawned behind them. The curtains bulged, drawn into the void, tugged and torn into strips. The shadows inside did not resist. They leaned into the pull, their forms stretching long and grotesque, arms elongating, faces warping into endless, silent screams as they were swallowed. The house moaned, beams bending as though about to snap. Nails screeched loose one by one, falling like iron rain to the floor. The hymn swelled into a chorus, hundreds of voices layered, vibrating through the very soil. Obadiah stepped forward once more, his silhouette framed against the trembling structure. "Let them be buried," he whispered, though his lips barely moved. The boards sealed suddenly, the void snapping shut. The curtains dropped limp. Silence returned, thick as tar. The overseer's shadows were gone. But the house was not empty. Something shifted just beyond the shutters, a face pressed forward, not of an overseer but of a woman with hollowed eyes and a mouth sewn shut by shadowed thread. She stared directly at Obadiah, her breath fogging the thin fabric between them. The boards above groaned, splitting hairline cracks across the ceiling, and from them seeped a black, glistening liquid, slow as molasses, thick as blood. It dripped down the walls, tracing the shape of words in the grain. The tree remembers. The hymn stuttered into silence, and outside Obadiah turned his gaze toward the great oak at the edge of the field, its bark scarred with his name, its roots already stirring as if they too had been listening. The oak stood like a gallows made of earth, its limbs stretching wide enough to blot the sun, its roots coiled like serpents beneath the soil. Obadiah's name was carved there, deep in the bark, each letter a wound that had not closed. The cuts were old yet wet, weeping sap that glistened dark as blood. The air around the tree was wrong, stifled, waiting, a silence that weighed on the bones like stones in a grave. Crows roosted along its highest branches, their wings restless, their eyes fixed upon him with hunger sharp as nails. He stepped closer. The scar of his name seemed to swell, the grooves widening as though the tree were breathing through them. He could smell it, the sap bitter and metallic as though iron had seeped into its veins. When the wind shifted, it carried whispers that had no tongue. Obadiah, Obadiah. The tree remembered the iron that carved him, the overseers who had driven it deep into its flesh. It remembered the bodies that once swung from its branches, weighted sacks of silence swaying above the soil. Some said the oak drank deep of those who hung there, its roots fattened on their blood, its bark hardened by their grief. He pressed his palm against the wound where his name bled. The bark was fever-hot, slick against his skin. The sap clung, to his hand, tacky, and when he lifted it, he saw it string between his fingers like sinew. Then the bark quivered, the carved letters twisted, rearranging themselves until they no longer spelled his name, but others, names of the lost, the broken, the buried, names he knew, names whispered in the night, names shouted in the fields, only to be beaten into silence. Each name flared briefly in the wood before fading back to Obadiah, the wound swallowing their memory whole. His breath caught. The tree had not simply marked him, it had claimed him. From the hollow of the trunk came a groan, long and guttural, like air forced through rotten lungs. Sap bubbled, spilling in thick rivulets that stained the roots black. The ground shuddered, as though something beneath had shifted, restless, impatient. Obadiah leaned closer, his lips nearly brushing the bark. "I am listening." The oak answered not with words, but with visions. In the sticky grain of its wound, he saw the overseers dragged beneath the floorboards, their mouths pried wide by silence. He saw their shadows clawing at nailed windows until the void swallowed them whole. He saw their bodies tethered to branches like swollen fruit, swaying in a wind that smelled of iron and ash. The tree's sap thickened, pulsing with each heartbeat of the earth. "Chain them." The voice came now, low, threaded through the rustle of leaves. "As they chained us." The bark writhed beneath his hand. A splintered knot pushed forward, splitting open until it birthed something long and jagged, an iron nail, dark with rust, dripping sap as though freshly forged from the marrow of the tree. Obadiah grasped it. The nail burned in his palm, yet he did not let it fall. From above, a crow shrieked and dove, its wings beating the air into tatters. It tore across his shoulder, clawing deep lines into his flesh. Blood ran down his arm, mingling with the sap, sinking into the wound of his name carved into the oak. The tree drank. Its roots quaked, splitting the earth around him. From the cracks rose fingers of bark, long and spindled, curling outward like hands reaching from graves. They clawed at the air, grasping, hungering. "Write them into the wood," the tree whispered, its voice now a chorus. "Seal them in bark as they sealed us in chains. Let no overseer's name fade. Let them hang here forever." The iron nail pulsed in his hand, alive, urging, demanding. The bark peeled itself back, exposing new flesh, soft and pale as the inside of a wound. It waited for the next name, open, greedy. Obadiah's eyes burned. He raised the nail, poised to carve, but before he could strike, the oak convulsed. Its trunk cracked open like a ribcage, and from within spilled a figure. Not bark, not flesh, something between. A woman, her skin slick with sap, her eyes hollow, her lips sewn shut with black roots. She staggered forward, tethered to the trunk by cords of bark that tore as she moved. Her breath was a hiss of leaves, her gaze fixed upon Obadiah. She raised one hand, pointing to him with a finger crooked and brittle as kindling. Her mouth split against its stitches, leaking sap as she forced a sound past the roots. The dawn smells of ash. The crows erupted into the sky, screaming. The woman's body collapsed into fragments of bark and bloodied sap, scattering at his feet. But the tree still bore her face in the wound, etched and waiting, mouth open as if to swallow his breath. And above, the branches sagged low, their shadows writhing into the shapes of ropes, swaying though no wind stirred. The overseers were coming, and the oak was hungry. The horizon split, not with light but with a seeping wound of red, thick as rust and bitter as iron. The air itself seemed scorched, though no flame touched the earth. The fields lay untouched, still hushed in dew, yet every breath carried the taste of ash, clinging like soot to the tongue. The overseers stirred in their uneasy sleep, their bodies twisted, blankets tangled, skins slick with the sweat of invisible fires. Within their dreams, roofs collapsed, barns roared with infernos, and fields of cotton became fields of cinders. The soil itself burned away from under their boots, leaving only blackened bone. Yet when their eyes cracked open, they found no fire, no smoke, only that taste, acrid, clinging, as though their lungs themselves were smoldering. And above them, the sky wept fire without flame. Obadiah had not closed his eyes. He stood beneath the oak where his name bled sap into the earth, his gaze fixed upon that strange horizon. In the red glare, his figure seemed carved from the very night, a sentinel unmoving, as if he had awaited this hour long before dawn was born. The air trembled around him, heavy with memory, heavy with wrath. From within the house of shuttered windows came a low moan, boards warping, nails rattling as though the timbers themselves choked upon smoke only they could taste. Every corner of the plantation quivered with unease, the stables, the lofts, the slave quarters. Animals stamped their hooves, rolling their eyes white. Birds did not stir from the trees. Even the river lay still, as though it feared what the sky had promised. The overseers rose at last, blinking, coughing into their fists, their throats raw from screams they could not remember making. Their eyes darted to one another, mouths dry, yet none dared speak. Their silence was heavier now, not simply absence, but a burden pressed against their ribs. They tried to swallow, but the air itself caught in their throats. One man, older than the rest, staggered outside, clutching his chest. His boots dragged in the dust as though the ground resisted his steps. He lifted his face to the dawn, and his eyes widened, filmed with terror. The sky's red was not light at all. It was smoke. Thin, curling tendrils of it reached downward, yet nothing burned. They slithered like snakes across the air, drifting into windows, seeping into doors. They crept into the overseers' rooms, into their very mouths, winding into their lungs. The men gagged, clutched their throats, yet no cough would expel the smoke. It was not something breathed, it was something remembered. Whispers hissed. Within the fumes carried on the curling tendrils. We burned before you. We burned when you told us to. Now burn as we did. The overseers collapsed to their knees. Their eyes rolled back as visions flooded them, visions not of their own lives, but of those whose sweat and blood had kindled these very fields. They saw men tied to posts, flames licking their skin while laughter roared in the distance. They saw women clutching their children as torches fell upon the cabins. They saw the cotton itself catching, a white fire sweeping across the rows, devouring all until only soot remained. The red sky pressed lower as though the heavens themselves wished to smother the earth. One overseer, choking, clawed at the soil. His fingers came away black, not with dirt but with ash. He stared at his hands, trembling. The blackness spread along his skin, staining him up to the wrist, crawling higher with each heartbeat. His silent scream contorted his face, but no sound escaped. His body shook violently before crumbling into a heap of powder that scattered on the windless air. The others reeled back, clutching their own arms, staring in horror as their veins darkened beneath the skin, pulsing like veins of coal ready to ignite. Their bodies had become kindling. From the oak, Obadiah whispered. His voice carried on the smoke. Dreams do not die. They return. The words slithered through the overseers' skulls like sparks in dry grass. Their heads snapped back, eyes blazing red, mouths yawning open in desperate silence. One by one they fell to the ground, writhing as if consumed from within. The scent of charred flesh filled the air, though no flame touched them, though no ember flickered. They burned in a fire that was not of this earth. The house groaned louder, shutters rattling, curtains shifting, though no wind stirred. From within its walls came the echo of 100 coughs, the hollow cries of lungs filling with smoke. The timbers bent, blackened streaks spreading across their surface like burns. The house itself seemed to breathe, exhaling a faint plume of ash through the cracks in its boards. The overseers crawled across the ground, clawing at the soil, leaving streaks of soot behind them. Their faces blistered, cracked, split with fissures, that glowed faintly as if embers lay just beneath their flesh. Yet they did not scream. Their silence remained bound. Their agony made no sound but the grinding of their teeth. Above them the red dawn swelled, boiling with something vast, something watching. The air grew thick, trembling, and from the horizon came the faint outline of shapes within the smoke, arms raised, eyes hollow, mouths wide in eternal cries. The dead were walking in the sky. Their forms reached toward the plantation, their hands stretching long and thin, fingers pointed like brands. And then the first cinder fell. It drifted gently from the heavens, glowing faint, landing upon the overseer's shoulder. The ember did not scorch his shirt, it sank into it. His body arched, mouth opening wide, and at last a sound broke the silence. A low, rattling scream, thick with smoke, echoing across the fields. The sky answered. More. Embers began to fall, raining slow, patient, as if the heavens had turned their fields into an open hearth. Each spark found flesh, searing it without flame, carving names into their skin, names that were not theirs, names stolen, names lost, names burned from memory, but now returned. The overseers staggered, bearing the weight of each mark. They became walking brands. Flesh turned into ledgers of the dead. The air reeked of iron and ash. The fields, though unburnt, shimmered as though heat waves rippled across them. And from within the house a final groan rose, low, thunderous, almost human. Its shutters burst open, though no hand touched them, and black smoke poured forth like a living tide. It rolled across the yard, swallowing the overseers whole, drowning them in memory. Their figures vanished, thrashing into the tide of soot. Only Obadiah remained untouched, the smoke curling around him like a cloak. He raised his head toward the crimson horizon. His voice was a whisper, yet it carried like a bell. Now the walls will speak. And at that word the house quaked, its windows glowing faintly red, its beams trembling as if alive. The tide of smoke pressed inward, vanishing into its boards. The plantation itself seemed to ignite with memory, burning without fire. From the roof came the groan of timber snapping, a sound that was not collapse but awakening. And then, from the rafters within, something began to descend. Thick, black. Ropes coiling down, swinging like pendulums, each loop wide enough for a neck. They waited. Its timbers bowed inward as though ribs bent to shield a heart that should not beat. The air inside pressed heavy, thick with centuries, smelling of rot and iron. Every nail in the frame quivered, not loose from age but shivering as if they remembered. Screams slept in the wood, not silent, not gone, only waiting for the hour they might rise again. The overseers crept within its shadow, their boots sinking into warped planks that buckled beneath their weight. Their silence was not chosen, but forced, their throats sealed, their lips pale from the pressure of words that could not escape. Eyes darted to every corner of the room, to shutters nailed shut, to curtains that stirred though no wind trespassed, and the house listened. Whispers slithered from the beams, faint at first, like scratches deep inside the walls. They grew louder. With each step the men took. Bend your back. Pick till your fingers bleed. Run, and I'll cut you down. The voices were theirs, each word a memory they had once spoken, spat back in tones not their own. The boards swelled with breath expanding as if lungs pressed beneath them. One overseer pressed his palm to the wall, and the grain pulsed beneath his touch, warm, damp, alive. He drew back with a hiss, his skin stained dark as if he had pressed his hand to fresh blood. The house moaned in answer, its rafters cracked, nails rattling like loose teeth. From the ceiling came a low groan, almost human, almost pleading. Bundis. Walls leaned inward, bending toward the men, pressing them close together in the stale air. It was not collapse. It was embrace. The shutters quivered, straining against the nails that bound them. One burst open, not to light but to a rush of smoke, black, dry, bitter as though it carried centuries of burned breath. The overseers coughed without sound, their mouths wide, their throats rigid. They staggered back, but the floor shifted. Beneath them, the boards softening into something that gripped their boots like flesh. The smoke curled around them, tendrils weaving up their legs, caressing their necks. In its folds came faces, blurred, waxen, distorted as though pressed into the planks themselves. Eyes opened in the knots of wood, mouths gaped wide in the seams. The house was no longer shelter, it was witness. Obadiah stood in the doorway, framed by the crimson glow of the dawn behind him. His shadow stretched long across the floorboards, yet the smoke bent around him as though it knew its master. He did not move, did not speak. He watched, and the house remembered. Boards split. From within the cracks pushed fingers, grey, crooked, splintered as though carved from the very beams. They reached outward, grasping for flesh, clawing at the overseer's clothes. One man jerked back too slow, and the hands seized him, dragging him chest first against the wall. His body sank into the wood as though it were water. His eyes bulged, his lips stretched wide in a silent scream as faces rose to meet him, kissing. His skin pulling him deeper. His outline burned faintly against the timber, a stain already old. The others clawed at the floor, boots tearing free from planks that bled sap the color of rust. Their lungs strained, their silence unbearable. Yet no sound passed. The walls spoke for them, filling the room with a chorus of cries, wails, the whip-crack of remembered torment. The sound shook the beams until dust rained from the rafters. One man fell to his knees, clawing at his throat as his skin blistered. Letters seared across his chest, glowing faint before sinking into scars. Not his own name, but another's. One he had forgotten. One he had buried beneath orders and cruelty. The house carved history into flesh, one body at a time. Above them the ceiling shuddered. From the rafters ropes began to descend, thick, black, coiling like serpents, each knot already tied, each loop swaying like a pendulum. The beams creaked, with the weight of what they remembered, with the weight of what they demanded. The overseers froze beneath the ropes, their eyes rolled white. Their silence finally cracked, not with voices but with a single guttural rasp. Sound forced from lungs like wind through broken reeds. They begged without words. Obadiah stepped forward. His boots did not sink, his breath did not choke. The ropes turned toward him, swaying, waiting for command. He lifted the iron nail in his hand, the same that had carved his name into oak, its point glinting faint with sap and blood. He touched it to the nearest rope. The house exhaled. The noose swung wide, dropping before the overseer, who still knelt, scarred with names not his own. The rope coiled, eager, its fibers trembling like muscle. The man thrashed, his hands clawing at air, but the noose slipped down, tightening, pulling him up off his knees. His legs kicked, striking empty air, his face swelling purple as the silence was broken at last by the creak of rope against beam. The other loops swayed, patient, waiting. The walls shook with pleasure, each beam humming with low, awful resonance. From every crack a voice rose, not of one but of many, a chorus bound in the very structure of the house. Not forgotten, not forgiven. Dust rained down. The floor heaved. The house strained as though it would burst from its own memories, its own hunger. The remaining overseers scrambled toward the door, but the planks bent upward, boards splintering, spikes of wood stabbing through their hands, their knees holding them fast. Obadiah watched, his eyes dark as coal. He whispered to the trembling timbers, "Take them." The walls groaned, the ropes creaked, the beams bent lower, closer, eager to answer. And then, from deep inside the house, beyond walls, beyond rafters, came a sound not yet heard, a heartbeat, slow, heavy. Each thud rattled nails in the beams, shook dust from the ceiling, reverberated through the floor like tolling bells. The house was alive, and it wanted more. The keys did not rest. They clattered in Obadiah's palm as though eager, as though alive. Forged not by blacksmith nor by any human hand, they were a collection of cruel shapes, twisted iron that shone faint with rust, strung together by a ring of bone that still remembered marrow. They rattled not with chance but with rhythm, like teeth gnashing, like chains struck against stone. Each one glimmered with a promise, freedom for some, confinement eternal for others. The overseers, broken, knelt in the red glow of dawn that filtered through the smoke-stained shutters. Ropes swayed above them, the nooses humming low, yet they did not tighten again. They hung in patience, waiting, as if the house itself deferred to the weight in Obadiah's hand. He lifted the ring of keys, and the sound filled the room, metal grinding against bone, a scrape that echoed through beams, and floorboards. At once the house stilled, the whispers in the walls quieted, even the smoke froze in its drifting. All listened. Obadiah turned the first key between his fingers. It was thin, crooked, shaped like a rib pulled from a chest. As it twisted, the nearest overseer gasped, his silence breaking for the first time, not into a word, but into a cry, muffled, strangled, as if drawn from the pit of his lungs. His eyes bulged, and from his mouth spilled not voice but ash. Obadiah whispered, his tone colder than iron, "Each key finds its lock, not in walls, not in doors, but in flesh." He raised the rib-shaped key and pressed it to the overseer's chest. The man convulsed. His shirt burned away where the iron touched, seared through without flame, exposing skin that split like bark. Beneath it was no bone, no beating heart, but a lock, jagged, black, set deep into his ribs as though it had always been there. The key slid in without resistance. The man's body arched, his mouth opening wide in a soundless scream as the lock turned. His eyes rolled white, then sank inward as though hollowed out. The ropes above him twitched, lowering, brushing against his scalp, but they did not take him. He was already claimed. His body sagged forward, hollow, empty, falling to the boards like a sack of ash. The key withdrew, glistening wet, its grooves lined with something darker than blood. The other overseers writhed, trying to crawl back, but the floor bent upward, boards clutching at their ankles. They were held fast, awaiting judgment. Obadiah shifted to the second key. This one was jagged, teeth sharper than any locksmith would dare, its handle carved from what looked like a shattered jawbone. He held it aloft, and it screamed, not from metal, but from memory. The cry filled the house, bouncing from beam to beam, echoing down the plantation road, rattling through the trees. One overseer fell to his side, clawing at his throat as if something tightened there. His chest heaved, but no air came. The key vibrated in Obadiah's hand, pointing toward him as a needle to a compass. Obadiah walked slowly, boots striking the floor in time with the heartbeat that pulsed through the house itself. He knelt before the choking man, his shadow falling long across him. "This lock is older," he murmured. "It was carved when you first raised your hand." He forced the jagged key into the overseer's mouth. Teeth snapped, shattering, but the iron slid deeper, fitting not the throat but something hidden behind the tongue. The man's body went rigid. His eyes wept blood. When Obadiah twisted the key, the overseer's body collapsed inward, folding, like parchment. His ribs cracked, spine snapped, and in a breath he was gone, sucked into himself until only the clothes remained. The key rattled free, wet, clanging back into the ring of bone. The remaining overseers trembled, their mouths open, in voiceless pleas. Their locks waited in their bodies unseen, yet the house knew. The walls groaned in hunger, the windows rattled, the smoke pressed closer. All wanted the turning, all wanted the release. Obadiah held the ring of keys high, and the nooses swayed. In approval. The sound they made was like wind passing through hollow skulls. He whispered low, not to the men but to the house. "Some locks open, some locks close, some locks bind forever." One key, heavier than the rest, swung forward on its ring. Forged of iron thick as a railroad spike, it bore no teeth, only a blunt edge, dull and cold, yet it shone faint, as though reflecting light. From beneath the floor, Obadiah grasped it, and the house shuddered. Every wall convulsed. Nails sprang from their beams, clattering like hail. The shutters burst open to a dawn that had no sun, only a swollen sky of smoke and red. The overseer's eyes widened as beneath them the floor split, a black fissure opening deep and endless. From its depths rose the sound of chains dragged across stone. The key glowed hotter in Obadiah's grip. One overseer, the last who still, fought against the boards holding him, screamed without sound, his jaw unhinged, his body thrashing like a fish on a hook. His chest tore open, not from blade or burn, but from within. The skin split down his sternum, revealing not lungs, not heart, but a gaping lock the size of a man's skull. It yawned, empty, waiting. Obadiah placed the blunt iron key against it. The overseer's body convulsed once, twice, then froze. His eyes glazed over, his skin grayed, his veins blackened. He did not collapse, he did not vanish. He remained upright, stiff, still breathing, but no longer his own. His chest closed around the key, sealing it inside. The house roared with delight. The overseer turned slowly, his movements jerky, mechanical, as if strings pulled him. His eyes, once white with terror, now burned dull red like coals. His silence was absolute. He had become one of the locks. The other overseers shrank, back, terror drowning them, but it was too late. The house trembled with hunger still unsated. The ropes above twitched, lowering once more. Obadiah's ring of keys rattled in his hand, their metal eager, impatient. And then, from beneath the floorboards, a pale hand reached up through the crack, clutching the edge with nails broken and black. Another followed, then another. The dead were reaching for the locks that had been opened. The floor did not rest. It sang. Its planks hummed with a low vibration, a dirge too deep for the ear yet heavy enough to press against the ribs. The overseers shifted uneasily upon it, their boots grinding against grooves not carved by carpenters, but by fingernails worn down to bone. Etched into the wood just beneath their soles was a prayer, a hymn scratched in strokes uneven, trembling with grief and fury. It was not written to be read, it was written to be heard. Each line throbbed faintly, as if the words themselves bled sound into the marrow of the house. When the men stilled, when their shallow breaths finally broke their silence, the hymn began to answer. From beneath the boards came a murmur, first faint, like breath moving through dry reeds, then thicker, layered, rising until it was unmistakable. Voices, dozens of them, hundreds, all tangled into a chant that had no end and no beginning. Deliver us, deliver us. The overseers froze, eyes darting down. Their feet shifted against the wood, but no step silenced the voices. The hymn had awoken. Obadiah stood at the center of the room, his face dimly lit by the glow that seeped through cracks in the floorboards. His eyes did not move from the trembling planks. The keys of bone and iron clattered at his side, but now they were quieted, cowed by something older, deeper that dwelled below. The voices swelled, words folded over words until the air shook with their fury. We bent, we bled, we begged. Our prayer went unheard, until now. The overseers clutched their ears, but the sound was not in the air. It was in the marrow of their bones, in the hollow of their skulls. They dropped to their knees against the boards, forced low by the pressure of the chant. The instant their flesh touched wood, their bodies convulsed. The hymn entered them. Images tore through their minds, burning cabins, chains thrown across raw shoulders, children dragged from mothers' arms. They saw themselves, their own hands, in the visions, wielding the whip, locking the shackle, striking the match. The hymn did not accuse, it remembered, and memory was sharper than any blade. The floorboards quaked. A seam split open, jagged, running the length of the room. From it rose a pale glow, faint yet pulsing, like the heartbeat of buried embers. The overseers scrambled back, their eyes wide, but the floor gave no mercy. Splinters shot upward, piercing. Their palms, their knees, their thighs, pinning them in place as though the house itself demanded their kneeling. The hymn shifted. Its tone grew slower, darker. It had become prayer no longer, but judgment. Obadiah knelt, pressing his ear to the boards. The glow painted his jaw in a thin strip of red gold. He closed his eyes and whispered, "They wait." The overseers stared at him, their mouths quivering, their silence unbearable. One man clawed at his throat, his face straining with the force of the words trapped inside. A guttural rasp broke loose, a ruined fragment of voice. "Pete, please." The hymn thundered at that plea, rattling through the beams until dust fell from the rafters. The prayer did not forgive. From the fissure rose a hand. Its skin was grey, its nails split, its wrist bound in phantom iron. It grasped the air blindly, then pressed flat against the boards, pulling itself higher. Another hand followed, and another. Soon dozens clawed their way upward, each finger dragging across the planks, leaving trails of ash in their wake. The overseers writhed. Their eyes rolled white as the boards beneath them grew warm, glowing. Faint through the cracks, sweat ran in rivulets down their faces, though the air was ice-cold. The hymn deepened. "You fed upon us, now we feed." The first head broke through the seam, its face not flesh but shadow, its eyes hollow wells burning with ember light. Its mouth opened wide, but no scream emerged. Only the hymn poured forth, louder, heavier, a tide of vengeance. The overseers thrashed, but the planks held their limbs tight. Splinters burrowed into their flesh, fusing skin with wood. They were bound, forced to kneel before what rose. Obadiah rose slowly, as though lifted by the hymn itself. His hand lingered upon the keys of bone and iron, but he did not raise them. This was not his task. The hymn had no need of locks, it needed only mouths. The faces that emerged were countless, each one pressed against the fissure, mouths gaping, voices blending into the tide. As they rose, the overseers' own mouths yawned wide, their throats cracking as sound finally ripped free. They did not speak their own words. The hymn spoke through them. Their voices joined the chorus, ragged and unwilling, yet in perfect unison. Deliver. Us, deliver us. Blood streamed from their lips. Ash spilled from their nostrils. Their eyes burned red as their tongues blackened. They were no longer men. They were instruments. The fissure widened, boards splitting apart, exposing a pit below, a churning sea of faces, of hands, of shadows pressed together, clawing upward. The overseers were dragged closer to the opening inch by inch, pulled by splinters that lengthened into talons. Obadiah did not look away. His voice cut through the hymn like a second blade. You prayed. Now you are answered. The floor heaved. The boards cracked wide. The overseers toppled forward, vanishing into the pit of shadows that swallowed them whole. Their voices did not fade. They continued to chant as they sank, folded into the sea of the forgotten, their cries tangled forever in the hymn, the fissure sealed with a groan. The glow died. Silence returned, but not the silence of peace, the silence of a breath held, waiting, endless. Obadiah stood alone in the ruined room. The boards still hummed faint beneath his feet, but the voices had withdrawn, buried once more. He turned his face toward the shuttered windows, where a new sound stirred beyond the glass, the creak of chains, the rhythm of iron striking iron. And when the shutters rattled open, the yard beyond was no longer empty. The fields were black with shadows, row after row, standing tall, each with chains wound tight around their wrists. Their eyes burned faint. As embers fixed upon the house, they were waiting for command. Iron does not choose when it breaks. It remembers. The night air trembled with the weight of remembrance, thick and swollen like a storm that would not rain. In the dark fields, shackles clung to wrists that were no longer flesh, and chains coiled. On the ground like serpents too long starved. Then, with no hand to guide them, no key to turn their locks, they opened. One by one, the links split apart with brittle snaps, collapsing in heaps as if ashamed of their long service. But the silence that followed was not freedom. It was judgment. The overseers, those who yet lingered in the house's corners too, broken to flee, too proud to kneel, stared in disbelief as the chains writhed like dying creatures across the floorboards. The iron slithered toward the fissures, toward the nailed-shut windows, toward the doors swollen in their frames. And when they stopped moving, there came a sound beneath them, the dragging of footsteps, bare feet, hundreds of them. The yard outside began to stir. Shadows lengthened, though no moon broke the clouds. Figures assembled, row upon row, their forms thin as smoke, their eyes burning with embers banked too long. The freed chains trailed behind them, clattering softly across the grass, still fastened at ankles and wrists that no longer bled. And from the sea of figures, one voice rose. It was not spoken, but pressed directly into the marrow of those who heard it. We are unfastened. The overseers clutched their throats as though strangled, their silence forced upon them more cruelly now than ever. They tried to retreat deeper into the house, but the walls groaned, the timbers bowed inward, ribs closing around a heart that was no longer theirs. Obadiah stood in the doorway, the threshold swollen with shadow behind him. The keys of bone and iron dangled from his hand, though he did not lift them. They were relics now, outgrown by the justice that rose from the fields. He spoke low, his voice carrying the weight of soil overturned, of graves reopened. They come not for me. They come for you. The overseers fell to their knees as though the boards themselves pulled them down. Splinters pressed into their flesh like thorns of judgment. They tried to speak, but only strangled groans leaked out, pitiful and hollow. From outside, the chain-song began. 1,000 links clattered in unison, struck against the ground, against wrists, against one another. The rhythm was steady, deliberate, iron against iron, echoing into the marrow of the night. The sound was both march and hymn, a dirge that shook dust from the beams and shattered glass in the nailed-shut windows. The figures moved closer. The house pulsed with their approach. One of the overseers pressed his face to the floorboards, weeping soundlessly, his tears vanishing into the cracks. Another clawed at the shuttered window until his fingers broke, leaving streaks of blood down the nailed planks. None could flee. None could silence the chains that sang. The first of the shadows crossed the threshold. They did not walk, but glided, each dragging the memory of chains that no longer bound them. Their faces were blurred, flickering like smoke over flame, yet their eyes were fixed and merciless. They filled the hall, brushing against the walls, bending the air with the cold of the river bottom. Obadiah did not step aside. The phantoms passed through him as though he were both gate and guide, their ember eyes never faltering. The overseers tried to scramble back, but the shadows did not strike. They only gathered, circling, pressing close until the air grew thin and the overseers gasped like fish on dry banks. The chain song grew louder, hammering at their temples, ringing their skulls like cracked bells. And then came the voice again, now many voices, a tide of whispers rising as one. You fastened us. You silenced us. You buried us. Now, the chains rose from the floor like serpents awakened, curling around the overseers' limbs, slithering across their mouths, their eyes, their throats. The men convulsed, their bodies thrashing as links burrowed into skin, sinking not upon flesh but into memory itself. They were bound not by weight but by history, by every stroke of the whip, every cry unanswered. Obadiah's gaze was unflinching. His whisper cut through the cacophony like a blade through rope. The night does not forgive. The chains tightened. Bone cracked like twigs underfoot. The overseer's eyes bulged, then sank hollow as the shadows pressed inward, covering them, swallowing them whole. When the tide of figures receded, nothing remained but heaps of iron, links piled in the shape of bodies that no longer drew breath. For a long moment, silence held. The figures stood at the threshold, their ember eyes fixed on Obadiah. He lowered. His head and the chains clattered once more, not as a hymn but as an oath completed. Then the night itself seemed to exhale. The clouds above split, revealing no stars, no moon, only a vast sky red as smouldering ash. The shadows lifted their heads toward it in unison, their forms stretching taller, wider, until they blurred into the smoke that poured upward. The chains dissolved in their wake, vanishing like mist into the soil. The overseers were gone. The key house, though still standing, sagged heavier, its timbers groaning as if mourning the weight it had carried for too long. Yet the silence that followed was not peace. It was a pause, a breath held by something too vast to end so soon. For beyond, the fields at the far edge where the river coiled like a serpent, a new sound stirred, not chains, not voices, something else, something older, the low tolling of a bell, though no church stood for miles. Its echo rolled over the land, deep and heavy, rattling glass, stirring dust, carrying with it a chill, not of night, but of the grave. And Obadiah lifted his head toward the sound, his shadow lengthening across the threshold, as the unseen bell tolled again. The sun rose over fields that had no right to shine. Its light broke across the horizon, pale and blood-tinged, spilling over rows of soil smoothed flat as polished stone. No mound betrayed what lay beneath, no mark of struggle, no evidence that the earth had swallowed men whole. The land wore silence like a shroud, as though dawn itself sought to hide what night had done, and yet the crows knew. They circled above the plantation in black spirals, hundreds of them, their wings slicing the light into shards, their throats rasping names too mangled for living tongues. The air vibrated with their cries, sharp, ceaseless, unbearable. To listen too long was to hear syllables take shape, syllables that belonged to the dead. Each name screamed into the Mississippi wind, flung out across the river, across the fields, across every listening ear. The house stood still, its shuttered windows heavy with the stink of smoke and rust. Its timbers moaned faintly in the daylight, shrinking against the heat, though no fire had touched it. The overseers' quarters stood empty, doors flung wide, beds stripped of their linens, as though the night had shaken them hollow. Yet beneath, the stillness was a weight, a hum, faint but undeniable. The earth itself was restless. Obadiah walked the rows of soil with a slowness that seemed ritual. His bare feet pressed down into the smooth dirt, but no print remained behind him. He carried no tools, no weapon, only the clinking of the keys of bone and iron that hung from his side, their faint rattle softer than the crow's shrieks, but steadier, like a heartbeat that would not still. He paused, lowering his face toward the ground. The dirt exhaled warmth, whispers curled upward, too low for daylight to scatter. They seeped from the soil like breath from a half-closed mouth. The overseers were not gone. They were buried alive in memory, their throats filled with earth, their silence forced upon them eternal. Yet beneath the soil they writhed, pressing against the packed surface, clawing until nails broke, teeth cracked. Daylight sealed them, but daylight did not forgive. The crows screamed louder. One by one they fell from the sky, black bodies striking the soil, wings splayed, throats still shrieking even as they lay broken. Their voices did not cease in death. They pierced the ground, carrying the names deeper, driving them like nails into the buried. The soil shivered. Obadiah knelt, his hand pressing flat upon the dirt. His palm tingled, the heat of the buried rising into him. He closed his eyes, and his voice, low and cracked, whispered, "They are not finished with you." Beneath his hand the ground pulsed. From the soil came muffled groans, like breath forced, through clogged throats. Fingers of earth curled upward, phantom hands that never broke the surface but pressed against it, leaving no more than faint bulges that vanished as soon as they appeared. The ground seemed to flex, as if something enormous shifted beneath, restless and swollen with rage. The crows rose again, circling, their cries reaching a fever pitch. Shadows lengthened though the sun stood high, stretching long fingers across the fields, until the rows of earth looked like ribs, a carcass laid bare beneath the sky. The overseers were buried, but they were not at rest. The plantation shook with their silence, timbers rattling, shutters banging though no wind stirred. The river in the distance roared louder than dawn allowed, its black water frothing, dragging at its banks. Every element, the air, the soil, the water, conspired to remind that nothing was forgotten, nothing forgiven. Obadiah rose. His face was carved in stillness, but his shadow stretched long across the field, too long, too wide, bending toward the horizon. The soil beneath his feet shivered again, and this time the sound that followed was unmistakable. A bell tolled, not from church or steeple, not from any hand-wrought iron. It rang from beneath the earth itself, low and thunderous, each strike rattling the teeth of those who heard it. The sound pressed up through the dirt, a funeral knell that carried the weight of every body interred in chains. The crows scattered in terror, leaving the sky bare, but for the light that now wavered, fractured, as if refusing to fall upon this place. Obadiah turned his gaze toward the house, where the shutters rattled loose and swung open for the first time since night's work. Behind the glass, shadows writhed, pressing outward against the panes, faces half-formed, mouths gaping. The house had eaten its fill, but still it hungered. The bell tolled again. From beneath the soil came a sound worse than voices, laughter, muffled, choked but growing. The buried overseers, swallowed whole by the hymn of night, now stirred beneath daylight, and though their bodies did not rise, their laughter did, crawling through the ground, swelling in the air until it drowned. The Mississippi wind. Obadiah closed his eyes, and the keys of bone and iron at his side rattled against one another, striking a note that did not belong to any world of mercy. The laughter swelled. The bell tolled. The earth shifted as though preparing to open, and in the distance, far beyond the river's coil, the horizon split with a faint light, not red this time, but pale, corpse-white, as if another dawn waited, one that belonged not to the living, but to the dead.